My name is Angie Von Slaughter, so if you're a first-time guest, I just want to welcome you here tonight. You'll notice that I actually say this often, and I don't mean it as a negative statement. I actually find joy in it. You'll notice, yes, pause. Kids, you are dismissed. Yes, kiddos, you are free to roam at this time. Actually, please don't roam. Miss Sarah's in the back. Find her. I interrupted myself, but I proved a point by interrupting myself that I was about to say this community I love and adore. We're all sort of what I often call a ragtag bunch of misfits. We do things a little different around here. Sometimes it's polished and put together, and sometimes it's quirky and weird and messy and rough around the edges, and that's actually really why I like it. So hopefully you do too. So if you're new, welcome. Welcome to the, I don't know, I was about to say show, but it's not a show, although sometimes it can feel that way. Welcome, really more than anything, to like a second home for us. This place has nourished so many of us, and so I hope that you find a place of comfort here. If you want to connect or know more about our community, I want to invite you to fill out a Connect card at the info table. You can receive emails if you want that give newsletter updates about what we have coming up, but you could also just get to know us personally. Kids, I dismissed already, so we'll skip along. Last week, we started a new series titled, Who is Jesus? And it seems like such an easy question to answer, but we discovered that it's not. That it might be for yourself at times, but then you hear other perspectives and you discover how complex this answer, or this question is, rather. And even you yourself may have found that question in your own life to be confusing. Sometimes it's crystal clear, you know the first response, and then other times you go, I'm not quite sure. So we're exploring this as a community. If you were here last week, you got to explore the 4 views of Jesus that we all talked about. But if you weren't, I want to give a quick recap. And I think it would be helpful even if you were here, because there was so much in them that I think a quick recap to kind of put into perspective where we're headed would be helpful. So here's a quick refresher. And I also want to pause and make a note that as we go through the next few weeks, I want to create a sense of openness here. And I know we already have that as a community. I want to remain in that. The topic of Jesus is one that can quickly get divisive in a community. And if someone deviates slightly one way or the other, before you know it, you're at odds and you're quitting and starting your own religion. And it can get that way. I'm going to go to this denomination now. The point here is really creating a sense of openness. And that's actually one of our core values at One Church, is openness. We really value openness and humility. And if you've checked out our website, you'll notice that we're less creedal-based and we're more values-based, because we really, truly believe in people over beliefs. So with that statement, all views are welcome, and there are plenty of them here. So the first, real quick, is the creedal Jesus, who is a Jesus that is the predominant view of Christianity, who Jesus is God and is necessary for eternal life. The second view is teacher Jesus, who's our moral example. And Jesus is basically, in this view, Jesus is a teacher to follow. But I should have mentioned this last week, that this view, I think, could be split into 2 categories. One view that would view Jesus as a teacher to follow that is also divine, and one that would say Jesus is a teacher to follow, but maybe not uniquely divine, maybe just a man. That really could spear in 2 different directions. Then we have enlightened Jesus, or some call cosmic Christ, which I know can sound strange for some folks that maybe were raised in evangelicalism. But this perspective tends to view Jesus as a human who tapped into this Christ consciousness, this thing that resides within each and every one of us, and he tapped into that and walked more fully into his divinity than anyone had ever done before. Then the last is mythic Jesus, who's sometimes called hero Jesus or Jesus as legend. If you ever read or follow along with any Joseph Campbell's work, this would sort of illustrate this view, that this view would discover Jesus as like a mythic pattern or a blueprint for humanity, if you will, that this has cycled throughout history in different stories, and we're invited into that narrative. 4 very different views. And if you have one very strong view, you may hear the other ones and go, what? And that's the point of this discussion. I mentioned that briefly last week, that growing up in church, I just assumed everyone believed the same way I did. That was very naive of me. And I quickly learned that people see the answer to this question very differently. Some of you may have views that you will discover will overlap. You might go, oh, I kind of view Jesus a little this way and a little this way, and maybe a little bit of this. Some of you may vacillate. You might start in one and end in another and then go back. And you'll discover that. So don't feel like you're stuck in one. That's why I think asking this question is important, because it sort of can illustrate more of a journey for us of being invited into this question. So because of the different perspectives, and because you are all thoughtful, intelligent, heartfelt people, in my opinion, I thought it'd be interesting to hear a few different perspectives from the community rather than illustrate them all my own. It might be interesting to hear some insights from a few of you in the community on this question, who is Jesus? So I've asked Ryan, is it Bordeaux? Is that how you would pronounce your last name? Okay, Bordeaux. I thought I should have asked that before I invited you, but Ryan, would you mind coming up? Feel free to go ahead and take a seat, if you would like. All right, or you could stand, whatever your preferred method is.
Everybody looks so nice today.
They do look nice today. And I'm going to hope this is on. Oh, it is?
I can.
Oh.
Is this loud enough for
It's
everybody?
on.
Just me talking?
It is now.
Oh. Hello.
So I invited Ryan to come up and share some of his thoughts on this question. Ryan, you've been attending One Church for
4.5 months.
Oh, okay, I was going to say 6.
Pillar of the community.
So, a pillar. That is a joke if I've ever heard one. That was good. So I want you to first introduce yourself real quick, and then I have a question which will lead into this discussion. So if you want to just let the people know who you are, what you do.
Okay. Hello, I'm Ryan Bordeaux. I'm a 24-year-old grad student who's really interested in movies and religion.
That sounds very, and so, man, I have a lot of questions just off that, but I'm going to stay on track because we have a lot to cover tonight. Because I have a feeling that what you do probably could intersect a lot with that last mythic view of Jesus. You probably see that pattern a lot in films, maybe, but we'll discuss that another day. So during a conversation we recently had, you mentioned that you had a lot of thoughts on the historical Jesus, and I thought it would be interesting to hear a little bit of what those are. Would you mind sharing?
Yeah, of course. Can I just monologue at this point? Or
you can do whatever you want.
All right, cool.
Matter of fact, he even asked me, is everything off, or is there anything, would you say, off the table?
Yeah.
I said, no. So I hope everybody knows that every view, the point is to literally give respect to a person and their view of Jesus, okay? So that doesn't mean you have to agree, but this is his journey.
If you want to call me a heretic, I'm used to it, so.
Well, that makes 2 of us, so.
So, just a little bit of background as to how I got into really caring about the historical Jesus. I used to, 4 years ago, almost to the date, I quit my job in youth ministry at another church in Tempe that was pretty fundamentalist, evangelical, Calvinist. Not that if that's the journey you're on, not to say that you're on a bad journey, but they weren't doing it right. And there was a point where I was asked to give a sermon on homosexuality and gay marriage, and this was before gay marriage was legalized nationwide. And at this point, I was still pretty conservative theologically because of where I was raised, so at that point, I still believed homosexuality to be sinful. But I was always pretty politically liberal, again, because of my background and just the places I've been. And so I was unwilling to say that legalizing gay marriage was a bad thing. And the pastor that I worked for responded with, well, Ryan, if we legalize gay marriage, God's going to destroy America like it's the next Rome, which is preposterous. I was hoping people would laugh at that, but everybody just took it really serious. So he took the sermon away from me when I told him that would be uncomfortable, and then he gave me environmentalism instead. And then when he told me to preach on how if we believe in climate change that we distrust God's plan for the planet, without telling him, I went in a different direction and preached about the reality of climate change a lot, and there was pretty much rocky ground from there. I ended up quitting. So after quitting that church, I went on sort of like a theological journey for myself where I realized that this was the first time in my life that I had been outside of that church because I was raised there and I knew nothing but that. So I decided to sort of blank slate my theology and to start over. And since then, I've been really into just constantly reading history books, books on religion, theology, philosophy. More than I eat food, I read books on faith. And so I really got into the study of the historical Jesus because as I've sort of read more and as I've sort of taken in all sorts of different views about what God is and what it means for God to be and the different ways in which God can be, because that's its whole theological topic, I've really broadened my view of what God can be. I don't have specific things that I would say this is what God is much anymore, but I really got interested because we all like to have a little bit of certainty in our religious faiths, and I really got interested in the study of the historical Jesus because while my view of God has become more malleable and open, I really delved into the fact that most historians agree that Jesus, whether or not you think he was divine, was a human being that existed at some point. And so I thought that can be looked at scientifically, that can be looked at from a historical lens. So I've really dived into who Jesus was in history and reading lots of books about that. At the end of my little spiel, I have a couple books to recommend.
I was going to ask you.
Yeah, there's one right here. It's my Bible. That was a joke. And so critical scholars have different ways of looking at the historical Jesus, and it's mostly through, especially because we don't have anything that was written by Jesus that we know of, it's through scientific and historical and literary critical analysis of the scriptures that we have on Jesus and the extra-biblical sources, so the things not from the Bible that we have talking about Jesus, because we have a few historians around the time who wrote about Jesus and his movement. But then they look at things like dissimilarity, which is looking to see if church tradition has been the same for a really long time, but then when you get to the origins of it, it looks different, which might suggest that the church might have distorted something that was originally different to befit their political goals or to build their orthodoxy. Then there's things like consonance, which is where if you see different faith traditions have been saying the same thing for a really long time, then there's more of a chance that those actually might, if you dig down, it might lead to some truth. And different historical approaches, like do things in the Bible match up with what was happening in history at the time? Do things in the Bible match up with one another? Do certain views expressed in the New Testament match up with the actual theological views that people had at that time? For example, you can go back and look into the behaviors of the Pharisees during the time that Jesus was alive and see that, in my opinion and in the opinion of many critical historical scholars, the Gospels of the Bible misrepresent the Pharisees and turn them into sort of villains of the Jesus story, when if you look back in the history and look at what the Pharisees believed from every other available text we have on them, we can see that Pharisees and Jesus actually would have agreed on a lot theologically, and they are actually more theologically liberal than a lot of Jews living at the time with Second Temple Judaism. And so I've been studying that for a really long time, and when Angie first posted about who is Jesus to you on Facebook, I commented, and I just want to share my comment with just a little bit of explanation on the way to just give you a little idea of where my mindset has come to ever since I've started looking at stuff about the historical Jesus. I wrote, Jesus was a human being, a first-century Jew whose theology was bound up in Second Temple Judaism, which was the brand of Judaism that existed at the time of Jesus after the first temple had been destroyed, like hundreds of years before that, but before the second temple was destroyed right after Jesus' death. He was a traveling charismatic who probably performed some healings and other mystical works, and he definitely believed himself to be an apocalyptic prophet who would herald the imminent coming of the kingdom of God. Neither he nor his disciples believed him to be God in an ontological sense, which is essentially from historians looking at what the phrases Son of God and Son of Man meant in the context of Second Temple Judaism. Because if we say those things today, especially if we were raised in the evangelical context, we have meanings that we attach to that, and both of them basically mean like some form of God. But there's a lot of historians who say that when his disciples and he were saying these things at the time of Jesus' existence, those terms would not have connotated equality with God. Jesus was eventually executed by the Romans as he preached to large crowds in the Second Temple, as the eschatological import of his message was politically threatening to the Roman Empire. Jesus' prediction of the imminent kingdom of God turned out to be wrong. He may or may not have raised from the dead. And when I say the eschatological import, there's a large section of historical Christological scholarship that looks at Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet, that a lot of his teachings sort of surround the fact that Jesus believed that God was going to enact the kingdom of God within his lifetime and within the lifetime of the disciples. And he says a couple times in the Gospels, like, the kingdom of God will arrive before you pass away. And there's other sorts of things that sort of follow along with that thought, which is a position called consistent eschatology. And consistent eschatology, if you're going to hold to that, it also says that Jesus was wrong, that what he thought was going to happen didn't happen, which can be a big change. But looking at the historical Jesus and seeing him as someone that might have been imbued with some sort of divinity, and as a human being who lived at a particular time, and also someone who could be wrong and who can mess up, that has huge implications on how I see Jesus as like a leader in my life. I see him as someone else who was in touch with God in a way that I might not be, maybe or maybe not, but he was still someone that could mess up and look at prophecies the wrong way. And that's just one little bit of how you can look at the historical Christ and sort of take these critical, scientific, historical analyses of who Jesus might have been in the past, and then narrow down who he might have been in our physical world and see how it might affect your faith. And that also opens up, seeing Jesus as someone who could have been wrong also opened up my heart to other religions. Sort of this idea of, if my central faith figure can be wrong, then other religions can be just as valid, even if their central faith figure might have been wrong about something. And so there's a lot of different implications, and it's really interesting to look at from a historical angle.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, because often I hear, it's interesting to hear the approach you took, because a lot of people will end up going, if Jesus could be wrong, then this is all wrong. Yeah. Bye. And that's the typical approach. And so instead, what I'm hearing from you is it actually opened it up to make it more human and approachable for you.
Definitely.
Okay. Did you have anything you want to add to that?
I did. I have a couple of book recommendations.
Yes, please.
If you're interested in this sort of study and don't really know where to start, I was lucky to have some people in my life who were having a very similar journey at the same time as me, so I'm always in the field for book recommendations from people. But if you wanted to start somewhere, if you've never studied this before, I would really recommend The Historical Christ and the Theological Jesus by Dale C. Allison Jr., which is a really good starting point into this kind of study. And then my favorite book on the subject so far, which I brought today, is From Jesus to Christ by Paula Fredrickson. And Paula Fredrickson is a woman who has a double PhD in theology and the history of religion. And the book's about sort of how Christ as a human morphed into this version of Jesus that we preach about today. And then if you really wanted to get down and dirty with the theology, you could read The Quest for the Historical Jesus by Albert Schweitzer, which is like a really seminal book in the study of the historical Jesus. But I would not recommend that as a starting place.
So not the first. Start here. That's a primer. Go there and then move on.
And you can always message me on Facebook. My name is Ryan Bordeaux. My last name's not spelled like the wine. Sorry to disappoint. And that would probably be better, because I won't be in the country for like a month and a half after this. So.
Excellent. Where are you going again?
All over Europe.
Awesome.
Because my girlfriend graduated university.
Congratulations. Ryan, thank you for sharing. Can we all give him a clap? Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. Thanks, man. I'm really excited that he mentioned not only his viewpoints, but a lot of books to launch into. Because in all honesty, thinking about Jesus in any different way, usually from what I hear, especially pastoring this church, what I hear more than anything that gets someone to even question is because something happens in their life. That's almost always the case. Always. It's rare, not necessarily, but some people might just be interested from a more intellectual level. Oh, I'm just curious, let me read other books. Usually something happens, and it then causes you to question your faith. I was about to start sharing my story. I'm saving that for a few weeks later. But that's exactly what started to happen with me, and why I eventually arrived at the point of asking the same question for myself. So I will share that. I promise I will share that story as the weeks go on. Now, Ryan mentioned a lot of things that I was like, oh yeah, I'm talking about that tonight, and I'm talking about that tonight, and I'm talking about that tonight. So this will be interesting. No, I'm glad. So this will be interesting. I'm going to dive into a few more of the things he said. But where I'm going is a little bit more high-level overview. But I think the real work is done in some of these books. A couple books that have been helpful, and authors in general, Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan, have written really great books on the historical Jesus. So if you're wanting to know more of that lens, the historical Jesus, those are also two other great authors to dive into, if you're the book reading kind. So first of all, I think what would be fascinating is to start asking the question that Jesus asked, which is, who do you say I am? So we're going to look in the book of Matthew, chapter 16, we read of a story where Jesus asks his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? Now, as Ryan mentioned, there's something interesting about Son of Man, and we'll circle back to that phrase in this series, Son of Man, Son of God. Most of us have understood that one way, and there's a whole other historical context behind those words, a lot of historical context. But the common English Bible phrases Son of Man as the human one. So we could say Jesus asks the question, who do people say the human one is? Which I think is a fascinating question, because most of us, especially if you've been around Christianity, have never probably asked much about that question. We ask about Jesus the Savior, Jesus the God, but what was it like for Jesus as a human? What was it like for Jesus to be a human? Now, if you are Orthodox Christian, you believe that Jesus is both God and human. And so I think it's important that we ask that question as well, that we dive into that as well in this. So before there was the theological claims and divine claims of Jesus, there was a man who walked on earth. We forget this. There was a man who walked on earth just like you and I. And so who was this Jesus? Who was this person? When speaking about the history of Jesus, it should be noted that archaeological or physical evidence of Jesus does not exist. I'm going to let that hang for a minute, because that one is always a hard blow to hear. Let me just leave that there for a second. Physical and archaeological evidence for Jesus does not exist. However, there's a lot of documented evidence. So we've got something different here. So we may not have archaeological evidence, but we have documented evidence, which we could say is through various sources of historians and writers at that time. And so the most detailed account of the life and death of Jesus is found in the New Testament, which we all know. We know those scriptures well. We find them in the Gospels. But let's say you're a skeptic or you're someone outside the Christian framework. The New Testament might be interesting, but it might not, for some people, be a viable source of evidence to them. They may look at that as a bias. So we could say that if you're outside of that and don't want a biased account, is there evidence outside Scripture? I don't want to get too hung up on evidence tonight, because the whole point of this series isn't even so much about proving one way or the other. It's actually what I said last week was more about digging deep and searching within yourself. That's the ultimate end goal here. So hear me out as we walk through this. It's not to prove or disprove one way or the other. So there's several recorded documents found outside the New Testament that mention Jesus. First century historian Flavius Josephus, he wasn't a follower of Jesus, so I think a lot of people that aren't Christian might find hearing him more credible. They may say, okay, well, you don't have a bias here. He's not a follower of Jesus, but he mentions him twice in his really extensive and large volume account on Jewish history. And Josephus was thought to have been born a few years after Jesus' death. So this would have been fresh, if you will, in the minds and hearts of people. This would have been fresh in history. So a lot of historians will deem him viable as a source. And then we have Roman senator and historian, I can never pronounce this guy's name, Tacitus, there we go, who also documented a bit about Jesus in his writings, specifically about the Roman Empire. Now, the thing that's really fascinating about his writings is a lot of them coincide with things written in the New Testament about Jesus's followers, his death, the Roman rulers who persecuted him. It follows along really well, but it actually gives like a different perspective because he's writing from a Roman perspective who would have had a deep disdain for the earlier followers of Jesus. So it's kind of interesting to get this other perspective that a lot of us don't get, is it is mentioned. So among the various historical documentation that we have, both Christian and non-Christian, you hear of a man named Jesus of Nazareth. So you hear this, you start to hear it, and you hear it enough that as Ryan mentioned, most historians would say, yeah, this man lived. He existed. This is a real person that lived and breathed. So who was this man? What was the humanity of Jesus like? Has anyone ever asked that question? Like, who was Jesus like? I had wondered that often growing up. I was curious about, okay, so we hear all this crazy, detailed stuff. I was more like, what is his day-to-day like? I mean, what does he do when he's not doing miracles and healing and saving and rest? Like, what does he do? What is he like? I wanted to know those details. So I've asked that, and I'm sure that many of you have answers to that question of what was Jesus like. And you might have thoughts about who he was and what his life was like on this earth. But it's a hard question to answer into detail because we don't have a lot of information about Jesus outside the New Testament Gospels, but we have enough to draw some conclusions. And so we're going to high-level overview what some of those conclusions are, and some of them will be obvious and you know some of them. Some you might learn something a little bit different. But since we're approaching it from just a historical perspective, we're going to focus on some of the things that we can draw and conclude. One of them would be that Jesus was lower class. So most likely, we don't have a lot of information on Jesus, most likely because he was lower class. We have to deeply acknowledge this. First of all, it was hard to get information from people at that time. Having records of someone that lived 2,000 years ago is difficult in general, having archaeological evidence. But someone of a lower class, let's be honest, the poor rarely make history. There's an old saying that says history is written by the victors, or you may have heard it, history is written by the winners. There's truth in that statement. There's a lot of truth in that statement. So why would anyone care about the life of a lower class man named Jesus? Jesus was born into a family that was part of the lower economic class. It's often noted he was a carpenter, which I'm sure if you've been raised in church in any way, you might have been familiar with that idea. But the Greek word here is tekton for carpenter. And that word tekton could be interpreted in a few different ways. That we could say carpenter or woodworker, but it was sort of a broad perspective that might involve even a stonemason, someone that would do carving, carpentry. I sort of look at it as like someone that did all the catch-all handyman work, if you will. They may have been a skilled craftsman, or they could have been the catch-all, I'll do this, I'll do that. They were genuinely seen, and this is important to know. A lot of times there's things about Jesus that are thrown in Scripture, and they aren't so thrown in Scripture. We view it as just like, oh, this is what he did. And it really holds weight. Now, knowing what he did, his profession, I think is important to this story, because they were seen, tektons were seen as ranking among the lowest in class. And usually lower than peasants, because peasants at least had land to farm, whereas tektons didn't. So they wouldn't have owned any land. So he would have been in a family that was lower class, didn't own any land, and they would have been the people that were just, I imagine, ready and willing and able to jump in and help and do work wherever they could just to pay the bills. And when I reflected on that word tektons, and this type of person, you know who is the first group of people I thought of? I thought of, if I'm transparent, I thought of the hardworking Hispanic men that stand in line and wait desperately outside my local Home Depot. That's who I instantly thought of. These men that are willing to do whatever it takes to put food on their table. Men that are often overlooked, people given jobs that, let's be honest, we pay because half of us don't want to do them. We have to be honest with that. And they are people that don't own any land. And so when I tried to bring this story to life today, I thought, oh, maybe, as we understand it, maybe Jesus was like this, the people we would overlook. Jesus was from Nazareth, a small village of Galilee in northern Israel. And while Nazareth was small, and there's lots of, the thing that's interesting, side note of scholars, none of them tend to agree with each other. You have some that say, well, Jesus was this, and you have some that say Jesus was that, and we have theologians, well-known theologians that are well-respected, and they disagree on these details. So it's really quite interesting here what they say about his location, his birth. But what we can gather is that Jesus was from Nazareth, a small village in Galilee, and Nazareth was a small it was a small town full of what we could say lower class individuals, most likely as well. But its surrounding cities were quite cosmopolitan or developed, cultured, diverse. So much so that maybe even some scholars believe that maybe even Nazareth itself was becoming permeated in this culture. But it was a heavily populated area full of Gentiles, and so the Jewish culture at that time would have been bilingual, speaking Aramaic as well as Greek. And in addition to the lifestyle, these surrounding areas would have had lavish imports, trade, Roman theater. A lot of things would have been found outside in these surrounding cities. And so there was a high contrast. The first thing in looking at this, and you're like, why does this matter? The first thing you get is a high contrast between class in reading about the lives of these people. That a little bit of insight from this alone paints a picture of a culture in which Jesus most likely lived, which would have been the starving poor and the extremely wealthy. It would have been this dualistic perspective, the haves and the have-nots. And various other historical accounts are written about Jesus, though not much is mentioned about the details of his life. And which is fascinating. We even see this in the New Testament, that from ages 12 to 30, there's a big gap. So we have 18 years of where did Jesus go? It's not what would Jesus do. It's like, where did Jesus go? He's missing. Anyone seen Jesus? Like a long time. We have this span of nothingness, unknown. They're unknown years. And it's fascinating because scholars have tried to figure out what seems like since the beginning of this story, to figure out what Jesus was doing during this time. And there's a few wild stories that have emerged about it. And here's a few. One would be that Jesus traveled to India to study with Eastern mystics. Another is that Jesus traveled to Japan also to study. Fascinating perspective is both of those perspectives link Jesus to Buddha because of the similarity of their teachings. That was kind of like a, what? Interesting. Others would say something different, and they think that Jesus had a more European flair. So they think during this time, Jesus visited European countries like Britain. They also would believe that Jesus appeared in North America. Any former Mormons out there? We got a couple giggles. So they would have believed Jesus appeared in what's called Northern America. I jokingly call this keeping Jesus white. Let's see the picture. Which brings me to point number 2. Someone just looked up. You're falling asleep over there, Kayla. Which brings me to point number 2. Jesus was a Jewish, not white. Jesus was a Jewish rabbi. He was Jewish in faith. We get that. But he was also Jewish in ethnicity. We often overlook both, let's be honest. But we really definitely overlook the ethnicity part. While this seems like a really obvious statement, because we know Jesus was born clearly not in North America, it's one that surprisingly gets forgotten. And most of our imagery and icons paint Jesus as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, really anemic and pale Christian. It's like, Jesus, when's the last time you've eaten? Like, do you know what I mean? It paints this almost frail, but obviously very Anglican, very white version of Jesus. And And I got to be honest, not only is this obviously historically inaccurate, it's also really, really damaging. Really damaging. And let me dive into a little bit why. This turns Jesus, who we just learned, came from a place of lack, a place of lower class. It instantly turns Jesus into a man of privilege, which he was not. And it sends a harmful message about race, which we have to acknowledge. And that our Westerners' inability to honor the image of Jesus or God that wasn't white. Race is a tough topic. We're just going to let that pin drop. Dr. George Yancey, a philosophy professor at Emory University, said that Americans equate white with good. Now, hear me on this before you read that quote. Americans equate white with good and pure, and black with bad and evil. Whether consciously or subconsciously, many of us have been brought into that. And that is true. That is true. Studies show that we see white as good and black as bad. So Yancey says these really sobering words. He says, if you internalized that worldview, how could a dark-skinned Christ wash away your sins? When we whitewash Jesus, we send a message to our dark-skinned friends, whether we realize it or not, our friends and our neighbors, that they're less than. We really do. And you're like, how is this about the historical Jesus? Because it is genuinely about the history of this person. Now, let me take that a little further in case you're like, I don't understand why this matters. We all know Napoleon was what? What's his ethnicity, if you will? French. Yep. We don't make him Hispanic, right? Right? Okay. We all know Thomas Jefferson was white. We don't make him fill in any other ethnicity. Why do we rewrite the ethnicity of Jesus? We have. You don't rewrite the ethnicity of someone in history unless you're trying to send a different message. So in doing this, I think we need to stay with that for a moment, that when we do that, we equally lose Jesus's, not only his ethnicity, which was rich, but we lose his heritage, which was rich. We lose his Jewish faith because we paint him as most likely of white ethnicity, but then most likely a Christian, which I always crack up because how is Jesus a Christian? He's a follower of himself? Like, how does that work? You know, he's not. At this point in time, Jesus is devout in Judaism. Devout. I can't tell you, and most of you probably have learned this along the way, how far a lot of Christianity can tend to get from that narrative. That we forget that whole connection, that is very much a part of who Jesus is. Historical or savior, it's a part of the narrative. So what was faith and spirituality like for Jesus? And I'm going to try to fast track it a little because I know we're going a little long tonight. Which, as a caveat, if at any point you have to leave early, you can, and I will not be offended. It's likely that he would have attended school at his local synagogue. So he would have become an avid student. I'm having a hard time talking tonight. He would have been an avid student of the Torah, an oral tradition. That would have been steeped in his blood. He would have been an avid student. We see this in Luke 2. I don't know if some of you remember this story when Jesus basically goes missing at age 12. His parents lose him, and he's found where? He's at the synagogue. Yep, he's at the synagogue learning. And so we find straight away that he is steeped in this tradition of wanting to have a deep knowledge and understanding of his Jewish faith. And so it's likely, many scholars believe, that it's likely that he had a deep love and reverence for the faith and that he had no plans to deviate from that faith or start a new one. That's also an interesting thing to note, is a lot of historians and scholars will point out he had a rich love for this and probably wouldn't have been like, hey, let's start this whole other thing. We read these books, or we read the words of Jesus according to the book of Matthew 5:17. Don't suppose I came to do away with the law and the prophets. I did not come to do away with them, but to give them their full meaning. And you get this idea that here he is. Again, no matter how you look at Jesus, from a historical perspective, we have this person that is saying, I didn't come to do away with that. I came to actually give it life. I came to maybe recapture some of its meaning. So it shaped him. It shaped him. A lot of scholars have noted even his healing stories. So historians will even note there's enough of Jesus that circulated around about him being a healer. Some accused him of being a magician, and that's probably why, because he was doing these miraculous things, and they thought, yeah, this guy is clearly doing some sort of magic. There's something about him that's unique. So even scholars and historians will say, yeah, this story is being told throughout history. So Jesus is found again and again talking about the ways in which we love and live here, now, on earth. So much so that he challenged the systems of his time, both religious and governmental. And so this leads me to point number 3, which I will quickly move through because most of you know this. Number 3, he was executed by the Roman Empire. We know that historically. We have a lot of accounts from that, not only in the New Testament, but we have a lot of historian scholars that have said, yes, this story is what we see even from a Roman perspective. Being a person of lower class, healing others, rebuking faith leaders, speaking of love and liberation while speaking against Roman rule and oppression is a recipe for death. I'm going to say so. Someone get a gag order. Shut that guy up. That's pretty much the narrative we're hearing. Hey, someone get that guy to be quiet. By far the strongest force at that time was the Roman Empire, which shaped the life of those in Galilee, where Jesus was from. Roman rule was known for its incredibly oppressive taxes. And a note about oppressive taxes, because if any of you felt oppressed in April when we just had tax season, I understand, I'm with you. Self-employed a few times over. But here's something about this version of oppressive taxes. We had crop tax, sales tax, property tax, import tax, war tax. The list goes on. That sounds familiar, actually, doesn't it? Then what the catch would be is that the rich Romans would then hire tax collectors, which a few of you probably already know this as well, is the rich Romans, they would hire men to go ahead and collect their taxes for them. Now, the tax collectors would then take money off the top, and that's how they would get paid. So we could sort of look at it as like this incentive. They got paid. So I look at it as like commission. That's probably a better way for our minds to understand is the more taxes I collect, the more commission I make, the more money I make. So there was some incentive there. But the thing that's interesting is that while the rich Romans paid to have their taxes collected, they themselves didn't pay taxes. Can somebody say this sounds familiar? Anybody? I think that's why I laugh when I read scripture sometimes, because I'm going, does anyone see the stark contrast between then and now? Like there's the phrase, history repeats itself. We're stuck in that loop. We need someone get us out. So many, y'all with me? Okay, all right. Some people I was like, you're going to find this boring because it's like a lot of facts. And then other people are like, no, this is really fascinating. I love this kind of stuff. So I'm like, okay, bring it on. Many historians believe this culture, the tax, the oppression that's going on, this is the culture of social unrest that sets the stage for Jesus. And I would call Jesus the liberator at this point, because it sets the stage for him to then speak a message, a counter-cultural message. And Jesus begins to draw large crowds, and then there's a buzz created, and then he's got followers. Now, on top of that, Jesus is slowly what I would call converting, if you will, tax collectors. He's slowly making nice with them, if you will, making connections and relationships with them to where they decide to stop that oppression and come follow his ways. A couple of those stories would be one named Levi, who some we would know as Matthew, who then follows Jesus and becomes an apostle, which is fascinating to me. Then there's another story of Zacchaeus. How many of you ever learned about Zacchaeus when you were little? We sang a song about it in church. Do you remember it? Zacchaeus was a wee little man. A wee little man was he. He climbed up in the sycamore tree. Yep. Okay, so that last line, for the Lord he wanted to see, as a kid, I always thought it was, I'm coming to your house for tea. I love tea, so maybe that's why. I swore it was why. And I had this picture of Jesus and Zacchaeus with their little teacups. Like, so, Zacchaeus, tell me about it. So Zacchaeus, the thing that's interesting about Zacchaeus is he's the chief tax collector. He's known as this. So he is sort of like the guy of all guys that's like, give me your money. And he is rich, he's wealthy, he's this collector. And even Zacchaeus himself has an encounter with Jesus. And what's fascinating about this story is, what does Jesus do when he encounters someone that is literally forcing oppression on people? He's pretty much highway robbery. He's saying, you're poor, you can barely make ends meet, I'm going to collect your taxes, and I'm going to give it to these rich guys. That's the kind of moral character and compass of this man. And Jesus says, hey, let's have dinner. And I always found that so fascinating in this story. He's like, hey, let's sit down. And this is the fascinating thing to me, if we pause for a minute, is that the hard work of love and liberation that we find in this historical Jesus is this. It's the hard work. It meets an enemy face to face, sits down with them, engages with them, and hopefully makes them a neighbor. And I think that the lesson of the historical Jesus is just that. That even if you didn't find the divine in Jesus, certainly that, in my opinion, is one of the most divine things we can do, is to sit face to face with those we don't understand, maybe even those that oppress, and say, can you tell me more about this? And I would imagine he would have been like, Zacchaeus, how did you get here? Like, are you okay with this? How do you feel? How do you sleep at night? Who knows? Maybe he treated him as his equal. Maybe he saw a spark in Jesus and went, I actually want to be filling my life with aliveness instead of chasing this endless dollar. Now, I love this quote by Richard Rohr that says, humanity now needs a Jesus who is historical, relevant for real life, physical and concrete like we are. A Jesus we can imitate in practical ways, and who sets the bar for what it means to be fully human. And so it's my hope that if from any of this, there's so much, we are literally just doing a very, very high level in this. There's so much content with the historical Jesus, so much of it that has really shaped my current view of Jesus. That I think we can see that there is so much wisdom and divinity in this human Jesus. There is so much there, and so much for us to see in him, and so much to possess. The musicians could come up at this time. So I would say that when we look at all the things and the historians point and argue back and forth whether Jesus was this or that, they all conclude, probably I would summarize in these two sentences, that Jesus was at least someone who is marginalized, and someone calls for care of those in need and the oppressed. We could say that Jesus is at least someone who challenged systems of oppression. Jesus is at least someone who was willing to or devoted his life and gave his life for this message. We could at least say these things. And so when you're a person that's in those different views of Jesus and you're like, I don't know how I feel about this, this baseline alone, I think, is living the most. And I don't want to say baseline. Let me recant that statement altogether, because that would make it sound like you can transcend or go any which way, and that's not the point I'm trying to make at all. It's that this message, I think, is something, the humanity of Jesus is deeply divine. And we see it woven throughout all history. But the question, as the band plays in the last song, the question I want to leave us thinking about, and hopefully even discussing after the service or throughout the weeks, is I want to leave you with this question. If the historical Jesus lived today, in what parts of society would we find him? And so be sitting with this concept of if the historical Jesus lived today, and many will say Jesus does. There's a lot I could say there. In what parts of society would we find him? And I think when we ponder that, we realize that the importance of what we think, our beliefs really do shape the way we live. And I don't think having all the beliefs right is the point. And what even is right? I'm at that stage in my faith that what even is right, if I may be so transparent and humble. But I am at this point where I think the way we believe shapes the way we live. And that shapes the way we live in this world, this planet, our neighbor, and ourselves.